Turning Tides is an AntiKs Entertainment affiliate. You can find us on social media at The Turning Tides Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and at Turning Tides Pod on Twitter. For more information, or if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please contact us at theturningtidespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.
Warning: this episode of Turning Tides contains depictions of war, murder, rape, sexual assault, suicide, torture, and genocide.
Upon the death of Aurangzeb, a secession crisis began. His 3 surviving sons each took up arms against one another, and in a bloody battle outside the gates of Agra, Bahadur Shah, the eldest, would eventually come out on top, killing his 2 brothers in the process. He ascended to the throne when he was in his mid-60s, and throughout Bahadur's short reign, his mental health deteriorated rapidly. He utilized aspects of the Shia religion in his government and daily life, which upset the extremely powerful Sunni clergy. This, combined with his advanced age and mental health struggles, led Bahadur to his grave more quickly than any enemy army could. Besides having problems with his Muslim countrymen, Bahadur was also struggling in the Punjab region. Sikhs were rallying around a holy man named Banda. His zealous warriors waged a constant campaign of attrition against the Mughal imperial army. He utilized tactics which are described by Nahal Kaur as, quote, hit, run, and hit again, unquote. Banda captured many cities and even threatened Delhi. Nahal Kaur contends Banda could have easily captured Delhi if he pressed his attack, but he decided to go on the defensive. Due to this, Mughal forces slowly reorganized and began to win back their lost territory. They cornered Banda and his army around Gurdaspur. Banda refused to submit, so he had his men create an artificial canal, which he then flooded. This cut off Banda's army from annihilation by the Mughals, but it also cut them off from the rest of the world. The Mughals formed a cordon around the artificial island and starved out the Sikhs. The men became so desperate they ate the flesh of sacred cows and other holy animals. After 8 months of hunger, they surrendered to the Mughals. Upon their surrender, 200 Sikhs were executed together. The Mughal court chronicler relates, quote, that huge plain was filled with blood as if it had been a dish, unquote. Banda was chained and thrown into an iron cell. Retribution was doled out upon many Sikh villages. Zakaria Khan is supposed to have filled, quote, 700 bullock carts, unquote, with the decapitated heads of innocent Sikhs. Arriving in Delhi, Banda was dressed in a gold brocade, while his children and disciples were dressed as court jesters. Soldiers were standing beside these captives with the decapitated heads of 2,000 Sikhs atop their spears. Instead of being downtrodden, the emaciated Sikh prisoners sang their sacred hymns in full voice, in defiance. The citizenry in attendance found amusement in their plight. One man shouted derisively, quote, now you will be killed, unquote. Nahal Kaur claims the detained shouted in unison, quote, kill us! When did we become terrified of death? Unquote. The executions began on March 5th, 1716, and lasted at least a week. 100 quote-unquote rebels were executed every day in full view of the public. Banda was tortured in the hopes he would reveal additional information regarding any other Sikh rebels still in hiding. After months of languishing inside a dungeon, Banda, his 4-year-old son, and several prominent Sikh prisoners were paraded through Delhi one last time. The Mughals gave Banda's followers a choice: convert or die. The first victim was Banda's child. Nahal Kaur says he was, quote, slashed to pieces, unquote, with curved swords. In graphic, artistic depictions of the execution, the boy has his stomach ripped open. A Mughal aristocrat was present, and he asked Banda how he could have been guilty of plundering Mughal treasuries and killing Mughal soldiers, considering he appeared so regal in his disposition. Banda replied, quote, I will tell you, when men become so corrupt and wicked that they abandon the path of equity and abandon themselves to all kinds of excesses, Providence never fails to raise up a scourge like me to chastise such a race. Unquote. At this final statement, Banda had his eyes gouged out, his limbs severed, his skin ripped off, and he was finally beheaded. The Mughal Empire was, for all intents and purposes, no longer run by the Padshah. Starting in 1712, the Mughals were ruled by powerful nobles who placed their own puppets upon the throne. The first of these powerful nobles was Zakaria Khan, who committed numerous atrocities against the Sikhs. His time as kingmaker was short-lived, as Jahandar Shah, his chosen ruler, was defeated in a battle around Agra. This paved the way for a new dynasty of kingmakers named the Sayyids of Bara to seize power. These two brothers placed Farrukh Siyar on the throne, and for the next several decades they would be the true arbiters of power in Mughal India. However, Farrukh Siyar's rule was rife with internal problems. Besides continued rebellions by the Sikhs, the Jats of north-central India rose up and threatened Delhi from the south. In the Deccan region, the Mughals were being outsmarted and defeated by the Maratha Empire at seemingly every turn. One of the Sayyids of Bara went south and signed a peace treaty with the Marathas. This deeply upset Farrukh Siyar, who felt it was shameful to negotiate with their biggest rival on the subcontinent. The Sayyids quickly realized they needed a new emperor, and soon. They stormed the royal palace, blinded the man they had once put in charge, and threw him in prison. For 2 months he was held as a captive before being executed by the Sayyids. The Sayyids scoured the royal palace for a suitable replacement, and Annemarie Schimmel states that they came upon Shams al-Din Muhammad, quote, by chance, unquote. He ruled for less than a year, as did Shah Jahan II. Finally, stumbling into stability, Muhammad Shah was the longest reigning Padshah of the century. Unfortunately for him, he dealt with constant foreign and domestic issues. One of his first acts was to silence the Sayyids for good. He had both of them executed and proved to be as intelligent and duplicitous as the brothers were. In times of peace, Muhammad Shah would have been remembered as a good ruler, a patron of the arts, and a womanizer. With his realm constantly in conflict, however, he is instead remembered as a lackluster emperor who lacked the true strength to keep the Mughal domain together. Powerful, quasi-independent rulers had been able to carve out their own kingdoms during this period of Mughal decline. There was the kingdom of Hyderabad, as well as the Nawab of Bengal. Both had wrested control away from the Mughal state while maintaining nominal loyalty to it. It was a similar case with the Maratha. Colonel Anil Athal claims Marathan leadership realized they would never be able to destroy the Mughals outright. Instead, they paid lip service to being Mughal vassals and bided their time until they could flip the script on their age-old enemy. Muhammad Shah was now the undisputed ruler of the Mughal domain, but he gave counsel to several questionable characters. The first was one of his wives, who had so enraptured him with her dancing that she had him wrapped around her finger. Another person he gave undue attention to was a supposed dervish who sounds an awful lot like the Indian Rasputin. Besides all this, Muhammad Shah enjoyed watching various kinds of animals fight each other. He much preferred this and other leisure activities to ruling the country. In 1737, the Mughals were confronted by a massive Marathan army led by their prime minister, Baji Rao. he was an exceptional commander, and he paved the way for the title of Prime Minister, or Peshwa, becoming a hereditary title in the Maratha Empire. Their cavalry army annihilated a much larger Mughal army outside the gates of Delhi. Mughal might was definitively smashed, and they were forced into becoming vassals of the Maratha. Before the Mughals could recover, news came from the west that a new threat was invading India. A Turco-Persian man, Nadir Shah, had recently usurped the Persian crown, and word had it that he was heading to India to punish recalcitrant Afghan tribesmen who had eluded him. Nadir was born to a family of lesser nobility. In his youth, he was so poor that his only means of income was to collect sticks, which were used for firewood. His lowly village was attacked by Uzbek raiders, and Nadir and his mother were enslaved. His mother died in captivity, but Nadir not only escaped his traffickers, he also finagled his way into the good graces of the governor of Khorasan. The ensuing decades of Persian interregnum would place Nadir at the head of armies which became increasingly loyal to him. In 1736, he launched a palace coup and quickly usurped the functions of government. He made sure to hold a kurultai, or a meeting of the nobility in the Mongol tradition, in order to have his rule cemented. All the nobles of Persia bent the knee to their new ruler. One of the few places he had dissenters was in Afghanistan, which shared a fluid border with the Mughal state. Confronting these tribesmen, Nadir showed that he was one of the great generals of the 18th century. He quickly reacted to military situations and never second-guessed his decisions, unless, of course, greater riches could be plundered. Like the Maratha, Nadir controlled an army which was largely cavalry-based, while also having a well-trained and mobile artillery contingent. In mid-June 1738, Nadir's troops stormed into Afghanistan. If those opposing him surrendered immediately, they were forgiven and left unharassed. If any tribes resisted, however, the men of the village were all killed, while their wives and children were sold into slavery. Afghanis in Persian Afghanistan began fleeing over the Mughal border in massive numbers. It was a true refugee crisis. Nadir followed these refugees across the Mughal border and began his invasion of India. First, he stormed Jalalabad and wiped out the city's population. Attempting to stop Nadir before he could pass the Hindu Kush mountains, a Mughal army 20,000 strong held the mountain passes. Nadir skillfully maneuvered around this force and scattered the raw recruits which composed it, while also capturing the Mughal general who led it. The first major city he captured was Peshawar. He moved on to Lahore in present-day Pakistan. Attempting to hold the city, 10,000 men were defending the most immediate river passage which led to it. Instead of engaging with this strong position, Sir Jadunath Sarkar says Nadir, quote, made a wide detour round Lahore and forded the river downstream, unquote. This made it that much harder for Lahore's garrison to hold out. The garrison fought a courageous defense, but the city's governor surrendered to Nadir's forces and was made to pay a massive war indemnity. In spite of this tribute, Persian horsemen began to plunder the city once they entered it. Nadir did nothing to stop his soldiers. Muhammad Shah and the rest of the Mughal nobility were frantically attempting to assemble a massive army to counter the Persian onslaught. As this host assembled, Persian cavalry struck deep into the Punjab, burning cities and villages to the ground. Indian chronicler Anandram says, quote, all over the land, property was plundered, and women outraged, unquote. Lawlessness and crime were the norm, and refugees from the Punjab suffocated the byways of northern India. The massive Mughal army, which may have numbered 1 million camp followers and men, lumbered into the traditional battle site of Panipat. The Mughal host was so large, however, that the decision was made to strike out west and set up camp around the city of Karnal. Advanced elements of Nadir's army were already harassing forward Mughal positions, and it would not take long for the Mughal Empire to succumb to this Central Asian horse lord, just like the Delhi Sultanate of yesteryear succumbed to Babur. Nadir would not be able to rout the imperial army easily. He had to contend with a much larger fighting force who had a home field advantage. Nadir's entire camp consisted of 160,000 people, of which only around 55,000 were fighting men. Arrayed against him were at least 75,000 warriors, as well as thousands of elephants and artillery pieces. The massive size of the Mughal camp was its undoing. The plain was saturated with people, while the outskirts of the camp faced constant harassment from Persian cavalry bands. The much more mobile Persians quickly formed a cordon around the Mughal encampment and began starving out the army they had trapped. Nadir once again refused to attack such a strong encampment. Instead, he skirted around the Mughal army and captured the city of Panipat, placing his army between Delhi and that of the Mughals. This would force the Mughals into an engagement on Nadir's terms. Battle began late on February 13th, 1739. Mughal intelligence gatherers had no clue where Nadir's forces were, and due to this, they lost an entire caravan of supplies, which they left unprotected on the road. Upon the loss of these supplies, their bull-headed owner demanded the opportunity to come to grips with Nadir's men and win back his lost caravan. Without any artillery, and only a few thousand cavalry and infantry, the Mughal army began their brazen attack. Upon encountering resistance, Persian scouts feigned retreat, enticing the Mughal army further into oblivion. By this point, other Mughal units had joined the fray, along with the entire right wing of the imperial army. The emperor and his reserves remained behind in camp, for some reason. Jadunath Sarkar says this impetuous beginning resulted in the imperial army resembling a quote-unquote mob. Stuck in no man's land, the center and left of the Mughal host were at the mercy of fast-moving Persian horsemen. Nadir was elated at this turn of fortune. Finally, he had the Mughal army out of their fortified camp, and he was not about to let this opportunity pass him by. The extreme right of the Mughals was the first to fall, with its commander fighting to the death alongside a band of loyal retainers. Persian units then fell upon the Mughal center, which proved the harder nut to crack. Jadunath Sarkar says the Persians brought up their highly mobile swivel gun artillery, which, quote, carried death into the Mughal ranks, unquote. At every point of contact, and during every engagement, Persian units were able to bring more men to bear. As the battle wound down, the most zealous Mughals tied the ends of their long coats together and fought bitterly to the death. At least 8,000 Mughals died in the battle, while Persian casualties were around 2,500. As the day descended into night, the Mughal emperor remained in his position, unable to move. Muhammad Shah rose the next day and sent out feelers for a peace deal between the Mughals and the Persians. He arrived at the Persian camp on February 15th. As these negotiations occurred, the Mughal army remained besieged by the Persians. Hunger and disease pervaded the camp and only grew in intensity as time passed. Nadir Shah had already verbally agreed to a peace deal, but his allies within the Mughal court began promising him much more riches if he continued his campaign to Delhi. Nadir heard of these riches and decided he wanted a piece of the pie. He waited for starvation to become endemic in the Mughal camp, and then on February 22nd he had the Mughal emperor imprisoned. Nadir was now demanding a war indemnity which was 10 times the amount previously agreed upon. Unable to say no, the Mughal emperor promised the exorbitant sum demanded by Nadir. In return, Nadir allowed the Mughal army a choice: go home or stay in your starved-out camp. Hundreds of thousands of people now attempted to leave, but the entire country was rife with banditry. Thousands more died on the road. The entirety of the Mughal domain was in a state of utter pandemonium. Delhi was perhaps the most affected by the anarchy in the countryside. The city's population had been under siege since the news of the defeat reached them, and peasants in the countryside rose with the news. Persian units first arrived on March 7th, after which the city was surrendered without a fight. On March 9th, Nadir Shah entered Delhi in triumph. His name was proclaimed as the new sovereign, and prayers were read to his health in all the mosques in the city. In exchange for his wealth and loyalty, Muhammad Shah was made the Mughal emperor once more, while Nadir carried off 200 years' worth of riches from the Mughal dynasty. As these riches were pilfered, the citizens of Delhi became increasingly angered by the presence of Nadir's soldiers. A rumor began to permeate the streets that Nadir was dead. This emboldened the populace, who started picking off individual Persian soldiers and squads who were not familiar with the layout of the city. All night and throughout the next day, the people of Delhi fought a bloody battle with the Persians, who were disheartened by the rumor that Nadir was dead. At least 3,000 Persians were killed in these street battles. Unfortunately for the people of Delhi, they were never able to combine and form a broad front against the invaders. Instead, Nadir began sending musketeers into Delhi to disperse the crowds. When the sun rose on March 11th, Nadir unsheathed his sword as a signal to commence a general massacre of the city's poorest districts. For 5 hours, several districts of Delhi were laid to waste. The Jamuna River ran red with the blood of the city's population. Heads of men were chopped off, while children and women were gang-raped and then sold en masse into slavery. As the Persians approached, entire households killed themselves. Women threw themselves into the bottom of wells until their bodies piled up. At least 20,000 people were butchered and a good part of the city burned to the ground. This says nothing of Persian marauders who raped, pillaged, and killed with impunity throughout the Indian countryside. Delhi was now a stinking pit of death, with many streets rendered impassable due to the masses of rotting human bodies present there. Nadir was busy collecting his spoils. He had collected vast riches, including the Koh-i-Noor diamond and the pieces of the peacock throne. The suffering of the people of Delhi did not end. Mughal tax collectors tortured and coerced countless people into giving up all their family had. This led to more suicides and hardship amongst the people. So vast were the riches acquired that the people of Persia were not required to pay taxes for over 3 years, while common soldiers in the Persian army received 18 months' pay in advance. If Nadir wanted to, he could have conquered the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, but he saw the Indian campaign as a mere sideshow compared to his wars against the Ottomans. As a result, almost as quickly as Nadir arrived on the subcontinent, he left, but he was now heavily laden with treasure and enslaved people. Like Timur, many of those enslaved were craftsmen and artisans of the highest quality. They would be forced to work in Persia to turn out exquisite goods for foreign markets. As Nadir left, the peasantry rose behind him, killing Persian stragglers and capturing wagons filled with tribute. Nadir was furious at this and ordered the extermination of many villages and towns on his way out of India as a form of revenge. It's impossible to know just how many died throughout the invasion, but it seems likely that hundreds of thousands died as a result of Nadir's terror campaign. Nadir Shah's invasion was the last nail in the Mughal Empire's coffin. The Persian horse lord proved that the Mughal Empire was a feeble shell of its former self. In his wake, the Jats as well as the Sikhs rose with a new ferocity, further destabilizing the husk of the Mughal state. Besides just wrecking the political stability of the empire, Nadir annexed large parts of the former Mughal state, including all of Afghanistan and several provinces in the Trans-Indus region. Within a decade, both Nadir Shah and the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah would be dead. The former was killed by his own officers, while the latter died following a brief illness. In Nadir's wake, his Persian empire split up, leading to an independent Afghan state headed by Ahmad Shah Durrani of the Abdali dynasty. Alongside his progeny, the Abdalis launched 9 separate invasions of India, but would face middling success. These invasions culminated in a titanic battle outside of Panipat. Often called the Third Battle of Panipat, a massive Maratha Mughal army was blocking the road to Delhi from the Durrani Empire's main army. The Maratha and Durrani armies were of a similar composition, but the Maratha made several crucial mistakes during the battle, which led to their ultimate defeat. Their initial attacks on the Durrani right were successful, but Maratha cavalry failed to exploit these successes. In the center, Maratha units were being stymied by the Durrani at every turn, while on the Maratha right, Durrani cavalry charges were proving incredibly effective. The Marathas were thus held up on the left and center and defeated on the right, allowing for their position to become enveloped and destroyed. This victory effectively ended the short-lived Maratha Empire and gave rise to the Maratha Confederacy, as well as the British East India Company. In the end, the Durrani Empire would continue for almost 100 years, but they would finally be supplanted by the Sikhs and then the British. Starting in the 1750s, the Durrani invaded in the west, while Europeans colonized the east rapidly. The two main powers vying for supremacy on the subcontinent were the British and the French. The British controlled modern-day Bangladesh and northeastern India. The French controlled parts of southeastern India. The British had been fighting sporadic wars against native Indian rulers for some time, but their first major conquest was against the Nawab of Bengal. After rebelling against British overlordship, the Nawab forced the European citizens of Bengal into a pit called the Black Hole. Hundreds supposedly died from malnutrition and atrocities. The British tore through India with a vengeance and decisively defeated the Nawab and his French allies at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. This was a part of the larger Carnatic Wars. The French suffered severely at the hands of the British and lost all of their land on the subcontinent, retaining only the port city of Pondicherry. The British used this new territory in southern India to start two inconclusive wars against both Mysore and the Maratha Confederacy. In spite of the common belief that European armies trounced native resistance to their conquests easily, the Marathas, the Mysore, and the Sikhs each proved capable of fighting the British to a tie or defeating them, as they did on several occasions. However, in each of these examples, the British used a combination of economic incentives, bribery, diplomacy, and atrocities to cow each of these societies in turn. It did not help that each of these groupings practiced their own religions and held to their own customs, which made it difficult to form intersectional armies. Throughout the 1760s, virtually all the crown lands which originally belonged to the Mughals were lost to a variety of clans and religious factions. Shah Alam II sought to recapture these lost domains, and with Maratha assistance he re-entered Delhi in 1772. Delhi was permanently garrisoned with Maratha troops, and the Mughal emperor ruled in the name of the Maratha Peshwas. This garrison would remain in place until the Maratha loss in the Second British-Maratha War. This conflict made the British East India Company the new de facto rulers of India. The successful rebellion of the 13 colonies in North America signaled the beginning of major expansion by the British in India, as they attempted to replace the riches lost in America with Indian riches. Throughout the 1780s, they repeatedly went to war against the Mysore Sultanate, who received financial support from the Kingdom of France. Starting in 1792, the French Revolution radically changed the global political landscape. Events in India were shaped by this conflict in a large way. Besides reigniting the feud between France and Britain on the subcontinent, it sent British conquest into overdrive. They attempted to gobble up as much native territory in India as they possibly could, lest Napoleon use any of these kingdoms as springboards for a larger invasion of the rest of the subcontinent. The British had reason to worry. Napoleon had many contacts in India, and he hoped to use his invasion of Egypt as a stepping stone to a larger Indian invasion. Napoleon, like the directors of the BEIC, understood that the real wealth generated by Great Britain came from India. Native Indian goods like textiles and rugs were largely suppressed by British authorities in the hopes of making India a vast dumping ground for shoddy British industrial goods. In the worst cases, the weavers of the incredibly fine Dara muslin cloth had their thumbs broken so that they would never be able to ply their wares again. This makes it clear that Indian industrialization was purposefully stagnated and destroyed by the British. This obviously caused numerous problems for the average Indian, who was forced into backbreaking labor on sugar, cotton, and grain plantations in order to make ends meet. These laborers were paid a pittance and then taxed for every conceivable item or good. This turned Indian laborers into virtual sharecroppers, too poor to advance and too hungry to rebel. In total, 95 billion rupees of wealth was estimated to have been plundered from the Indian subcontinent by the British. This says nothing of at least 30 million people who died of starvation, atrocities, and preventable diseases. How exactly did the British go about annexing the vast Indian subcontinent and the many peoples that lived there? In short, it was a simple process of divide and conquer, something which was easy to do since the Indian subcontinent was already divided along lines of caste, religion, state, and customs. Some historians claim that the British Empire in India was acquired purely by accident. But Alexander Mukhoty says, quote, "There was nothing accidental about British conquests," unquote. Starting in 1600, the British East India Company was founded, modeling themselves after the Dutch East India Company. It was designed to supplant and outbid this entity using vast financial capital or outright brute force. In reality, the BEIC never wished to create an empire, but capitalism required more bodies and more wealth in order to remain functioning. It also incentivized the greedy and pernicious to launch more and more exploitative raids deeper into the subcontinent. BEIC partnerships were mafioso-like in their terms. Indian rulers agreed to, quote-unquote, host a garrison of BEIC troops for, quote-unquote, protection. In return, tribute had to be paid to the BEIC, and native troops had to be furnished. British propaganda back home turned the conquests of the subcontinent and the island of Sri Lanka into quote-unquote civilizing missions against savage people. The BEIC's military exploits are well recorded. On the surface, they tell the story of how few stood against many and came out triumphant. The reality, however, is that this was not heroic in the slightest. Alexander Mukhoty attributes the fall of native Indian states to a number of factors. Great Britain was caught up in a whirlwind of conflicts, which required the island nation to become more proficient in the ways of war. Asian states like China, Japan, and the Mughal Empire had natural geographic and technological barriers which had prevented these societies from falling into these same decades-long conflicts. This was seemingly a blessing, but in reality, this lack of geopolitical competition proved the undoing of many Asian states, especially when confronted by zealous European empire builders. This argument could be advanced towards many native peoples who were decimated by Europeans. It does not answer every question, but it helps to clarify many aspects of it. The British were equally helped along by some of the truly great administrators and leaders of armies that the era produced. Clive, Cornwallis, and Wellesley are all well-remembered names throughout military history. These men spanned continents and delivered victories and reforms in Britain's name, which ensured that the sun never set on the British Empire. It also helped that British control of the seas meant that they could easily funnel men and supplies to the subcontinent, while Indian rulers were left holding on for dear life against the coming British onslaught. Indian states tried to adjust, with some experiencing success at modernizing their armies, while most experienced severe growing pains. European mercenaries flooded India in the hopes of gaining a sultan or raja's loyalty. Besides a handful of examples, Indian armies failed time and again when confronted by more coordinated and better-led European forces. Another major factor contributing to the BEIC's victory, which is only recently getting more attention, is the fact that most of the BEIC's forces were Indian. These sepoys fought in countless campaigns all across India and usually came from one of the many BEIC dependencies. Alexander Mukhoty wisely points out, quote, All of this meant that the BEIC could use Indian resources and manpower to overcome Indian resistance, unquote. The British also cunningly used offensive alliances to attack their enemies on multiple fronts. Against Mysore, for example, it took a combined force from Hyderabad, the Maratha, and the British to finish off the Sultanate for good. BEIC power had spread meteorically across India due to the influence of BEIC Governor Richard Wellesley, brother to the Duke of Wellington. His pernicious, ambitious, and coercive style of leadership had strained the coffers of the BEIC's treasury to its breaking point. Besides Napoleon Bonaparte, there was not a greater conqueror in the 19th century than Wellesley, but his policy of empire building was an affront to the BEIC's directors, who were concerned with economic viability above all else. He was replaced by Lord Cornwallis of American Revolutionary War fame. He quickly set about finding a favorable peace with the Maratha Confederacy, who were proving incredibly obstinate, especially under their leader Holkar. Holkar would go on to threaten British forces in a number of impressive campaigns, even being derisively called, quote, the prevailing power in Hindustan, unquote. This whole time, the Mughals were nominally in charge of Delhi and its immediate environs. In reality, however, the Mughals were purely puppet rulers, forced to bow first to the Marathans and then to the British. The British keenly realized that the Mughals were the preeminent dynasty in India, at least in the memories of the common people. Due to this, BEIC directors made it a point to say that they were only serving at the Mughal emperor's request. The current emperor was Shah Alam II, also known as the Blind Son. He was the only Mughal emperor to be blinded whilst on the throne, but he was able to maintain his authority in spite of the precepts against blind rulers in Sharia law. This act was perpetrated by rebellious Afghani tribesmen who had stormed the royal palace and taken Shah Alam's eyes as part of the peace settlement. In spite of his blinding, Shah Alam is remembered as a well-versed poet. He even dedicated several verses to his blinding, writing, quote, "The icy storm of fate rose up to humiliate me, blowing to the wind the foliage and the flowers of rulership. I was the son of the spheres, raised high in the kingdom, but alack, alas, this fall brought me to the night of cessation. My eyes were put out by cruel fate. Yet it is better that I do not see what has become of my domain. I committed sins, for which this was the punishment. So I hope now my guilt will finally be expiated. The young Afghan, he cast the splendor of the kingdom to the wind. Who but God was there to show me some friendship? I nourished the snake with milk. I raised its offspring myself. It grew stronger and grew and drank, oh calamity, my blood," unquote. Shah Alam would continue his nominal rule until 1806, when he passed away. The same year Shah Alam II passed, Napoleon's continental system went into effect. It proved a complete failure for Napoleonic Europe and for many European port cities who relied on British imports and the ability to send exports to foreign shores. Also, during the same year, an uprising of sepoys was brutally crushed by British authorities. It would prove the first of several. In the hopes of preventing further exploits from either Napoleon or Russia, British officials in India reached out to the Durrani dynasty in Afghanistan and even signed a treaty of friendship and union with the Afghan state. Besides the Afghans, the BEIC reached out to the Sikh Empire run by Ranjit Singh. They signed a similar treaty with them in 1809. Besides sporadic naval engagements and piracy in the Indian Ocean, Napoleon was never able to significantly threaten or even harass the British Empire in India. Beyond losing access to India throughout the duration of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, France lost permanent control of the Mauritius island, which remained a part of Great Britain until the late 1960s. Several years after the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain launched its final crusade against the Maratha Confederacy. The British started the Third Maratha War under the pretext of ending banditry in the countryside. In a hard-fought campaign, Maratha power was extinguished, and they were forced into a subservient role under the British. Next, the British tried and failed, and then tried again at conquering Afghanistan. They eventually succeeded in placing a friendly ruler on the throne. This was a part of the larger Great Game between Russia and Great Britain. Great Britain wanted a friendly Afghan state as a possible buffer to any Russian invasion of India through Central Asia. Turning southwest, the British pacified the Baluchi people of Sindh. In several months, they succeeded in conquering the country. The British didn't stop there. They turned their arms on the Sikhs. The Sikhs had gone through a radical transformation since the rebellion of Banda in 1708. Now, the Sikhs were a cohesive military empire under the iron rule of the descendants of Ranjit Singh. They defeated the Afghans in numerous battles, proving their vitality in war and gaining the Koh-i-Noor diamond as tribute. Their political, religious messaging was extremely militaristic. Instead of preaching nonviolence, Sikh leaders now said, quote, "God is the sword, and the sword is God," unquote. They would not suffer the abuses and provocations of the British without a serious fight. The First Sikh War began in 1845. It proved to be one of the toughest colonial wars the British would ever fight. The Battle of Feroza Shah stands out as being particularly violent. Over 12,000 sepoys, Britishers, and Sikhs were made casualties after 2 days of horrendous hand-to-hand fighting. During the Battle of Sebrown, another 12,000 people were mangled in the course of an afternoon. Even the mighty Sikhs proved incapable of defeating the British, and after another bloody conflict in 1849, the Sikhs became loyal subjects of the British Crown, where they would go on to play a huge role in the First War of Indian Independence. Amongst the tribute collected, the Koh-i-Noor diamond passed into British possession, where it remains a part of the British crown jewels to this day. Akbar II was the Mughal emperor during the first half of the 19th century. Like his namesake, Akbar II ruled for an incredibly long time. For 3 decades, he was the acting quote-unquote king of Delhi, who gave out honorific titles to loyal vassals of the British. He attempted to show signs of independence, even having envoys protest the treatment of his subjects under British care, but these protests largely fell on deaf ears. British rule was becoming more and more consolidated throughout present-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Akbar II would die in 1837, paving the way for the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Zafar, to ascend on September 28th. The Mughal dynasty was no longer flushed with wealth. Instead, the Mughal royal family was forced to accept a miserable allowance from the British, which was equivalent to that paid to a head servant. Ira Mukhoty says, quote, "Fearsome eunuchs are now unable to prevent intruders from slipping into the harem, and Zafar's concubines become pregnant by lowly court musicians," unquote. These poor conditions only grew worse the farther down the chain of royalty you went. Low-ranking nobility were truly destitute and were heard wailing out in hunger on most nights. Under these conditions, Ira Mukhoty concludes, quote, "The timid lamp will flicker and then burn out completely," unquote. India was a totally different place from the one which Aurangzeb had left over 100 years ago. The subcontinent was no longer a major exporter of fabrics and textiles which were renowned throughout the world. Now, India was a vast plantation, where food was grown and harvested at exorbitantly low costs, and then sold at a profit by English merchants in places like Italy and France. This had serious ramifications on the rest of the world, as the food crops and cash crops grown in India created a glut of resources on the world markets. This caused inflation amongst the poorest in Europe and radicalized the populations there, paving the way for the spread of nationalism. As the world rapidly modernized due to the riches of the global South, which were exploited by Europeans, new conflicts between subject and subjugator arose. The French-designed mini ball was introduced during this time. This ball of ammunition was encased in paper, and the paper was greased. This paper was designed to be torn open with one's teeth in order to access the ammunition inside. Amongst the sepoys of the BEIC's standing army, Hindus and Muslims alike became enraged when they discovered that the grease from both cows, which are holy creatures in Hindu culture, and pigs, which are considered dirty in Muslim culture, was used to cover the paper used in the ammunition. British observers scoffed at the sepoys' complaints, and even placed a unit of cavalry under military arrest for refusing to use the ammunition. This dismissive attitude would nearly cause the downfall of the British Empire in India. The Great Mutiny, or First Indian War of Independence, began in Meerut on May 10, 1857, where the offending cavalry unit was being held in the city's jail. As their British officers attended Mass, the sepoys of the Bengal garrison released their comrades and began a massacre of the Europeans in their midst. This group of sepoys fled to Delhi, where they joined forces with the Indian garrison of the city and began another massacre of Europeans. The rebels declared Bahadur Zafar their leader against his own wishes, but the rebels felt they needed a symbolic figurehead from the quote-unquote old India in order to energize their movement and kick out the Europeans for good. The few loyal BEIC regiments which remained were largely stationed in the east and west, while most of central and northern India was held by the rebels. The British were helped in a huge way by the Gurkha tribe of present-day Nepal, as well as the Sikhs, who both showed their loyalty to the British Crown. Due to the aid given by these forces, as well as hurried reinforcements from Europe, British units managed to go on the offensive. The British arrived at the gates of Delhi in September of 1857, and the rebels attempted to hold out as long as possible, in the hopes of gaining more allies or support, but it was to no avail. The superior organization, leadership, and armaments of the British won out against the bravery and numbers of the rebels inside Delhi. In a week-long assault, the city fell to the British. Thousands died in the carnage. The last Mughal emperor and his family were made examples of. The Mughal princes were stripped of their finery, robbed, and shot in front of the people of Delhi, while Bahadur Zafar was sentenced to exile in Burma, where he died soon after. In total, at least 800,000 people died as a result of the First War of Indian Independence. It was not only the official end of the Mughal dynasty, but it was also the official end of the British East India Company, which proved, through negligence and mismanagement, to not be up to the job of controlling an entire state containing hundreds of millions of people. Management of the Indian subcontinent fell directly to the British government, and Queen Victoria was named the first Empress of the British Raj. Besides his menial duties as the King of Delhi, the last Mughal emperor was more well known as a poet. His poems were filled with heartache and longing. His epitaph reads, quote, "My heart has no repose in this despoiled land. Who has ever felt fulfilled in this futile world? The nightingale complains about neither the sentinel nor the hunter. Fate has decreed imprisonment during the harvest of spring. Tell these longings to go dwell elsewhere. What space is there for them in this besmirched heart?" Sitting on a branch of flowers, the nightingale rejoices. It has strewn thorns in the garden of my heart. I asked for a long life. I received 4 days. 2 passed in desire, 2 in waiting. The days of life are over. Evening has fallen. I shall sleep, legs outstretched in my tomb. How unfortunate is Zafar! For his burial, not even 2 yards of land were to be had in the land of his beloved." Unquote. Laid to rest alongside Zafar was over 700 years of Turco-Mongolian overlordship in the Asian continent. In recent years, Mughal study has increased significantly throughout the subcontinent, specifically in India. This has been fueled by a wave of Hindu nationalism which seeks to portray anything Mughal as bad and anything Hindu, and therefore quote-unquote Indian, as good. This has been taken to violent extremes. Hate crimes against Muslims are increasing rapidly in India, with many people being attacked and lynched solely for their religious beliefs. In one instance, Narendra Modi referred to Muslims living in India as quote-unquote infiltrators. In another instance, a Hindu school teacher forced her students to take turns slapping a Muslim boy. She says, quote, "I do not regret my act. People are with me," unquote. Indian history books are being petitioned to cease the teaching of Mughal history altogether. Mughal buildings, which stood for hundreds of years, have been vandalized. This ironically includes the empty gravesite of Bahadur Zafar, the man named by Muslims and Hindus alike to lead the 1857 War of Independence. Destroying and changing history is counterproductive to the overall goals of Hindu nationalists. In their quest to stamp out the dogmatic teachings of tyrants and bigots like Aurangzeb, they have stooped to a similar level, as we have seen with many oppressed peoples who turn to oppressing others as a form of self-preservation. Perhaps Indian citizens are beginning to realize that the only way to break this cycle of violence is through more understanding and not less. The most recent general election showed a serious decline in support for Modi and the right-wing National Democratic Alliance. If various Indian, Bangladeshi, and Pakistani leaders continue their corrosive policies of nationalism and antagonism, the people living in the subcontinent will never get to move past the divisions which have been used to exploit and separate them for 1,000 years. The history of the subcontinent, for better or worse, has been defined in many ways by the people who came, saw, and conquered the land, and the people who lived, worked, and assisted them on their quest. The Mughals are as much a part of the subcontinent and its history as the British are, and without them, numerous buildings, languages, traditional Indian dances, dishes, and works of art would never exist. That being said, the Mughals were an empire, and like all empires, they were founded on the supposed divine right to rule, and they brought about the deaths of millions of people. Although the Mughals no longer exist, their memory lives on with the buildings and art they left behind, as well as in the gravesites and many lives they took away. It is now the job of all human beings, regardless of skin color, religious creed, or culture, to preserve their history, lest we fall victim to it once again. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm your host, Joseph Pascone. I hope you've enjoyed this broad look at the Mughal Empire and their influence on the modern-day Indian subcontinent. I apologize to anyone for any mispronunciations, and I hope that I was able to present a mildly confusing history in a concise, entertaining, and informative way. On the next episode of Turning Tides, we will be pausing our standard episodic series in favor of an interview with the incredible author, journalist, and New York Times senior editor Mark Bulick. He will be on to discuss his latest book, Ambush at Central Park, When the IRA Came to New York. Be sure to check his book out, especially if you are at all interested in Irish American, or New York City history. Following this, we will be delving into an entirely new series on the life and times of Charles XII of Sweden, who came to power in an empire doomed to fail but one which he died fighting to protect and expand. Once more, thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all have a great day.
If you like what you heard today, you can support us by donating on PayPal at Turning Tides Podcast 1. Thanks for the support and thank you for listening. If you like what you've heard, we'd really appreciate it if you take the time to rate and review Turning Tides on whatever platform you use to listen, and share the show on social media. It really helps us to bring the show to more listeners. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to everyone for listening. We'd also like to say thank you to Movo Photo. We use their sound equipment for this podcast, as well as all of our other projects at AntiKs Entertainment. They make great equipment at great prices, and we really appreciate that they make content creating so accessible for indie creators like us. Check them out on social media at Movo Photo, MOVOPHOTO. Thank you again.